Welcome back to The Bible and Its Cultural Influence, a series of lectures taken from a class of the same name. I'm Seth Pace, and I'll be leading our lecture today. We're about to begin a series of lectures on the teachings of Jesus. This will be part 1, and we'll be covering the Good Samaritan today and the story of the Prodigal Son. So one of the first things we need to do when we're dealing with the story of the Good Samaritan is, of course, figure out who or what is a Samaritan. Well, if you remember from our earlier discussions, we have Samaria right here in the middle. So there's Samaria, with Galilee on the top and Judea down on the bottom. And we talked about in the early life of Jesus how when he was up in the land of Galilee, how they would cross over the Jordan River and come down on this side and then cross back over near Jericho and go up to Jerusalem, which is located right there. They did that so they would stay out of this area known as Samaria. It's an odd story, but when the kingdom divided, and this is after the reign of David and Solomon, the kingdom split in two. And then, of course, those in the southern kingdom were taken, and the Jews were captured by the Babylonians and taken by Nebuchadnezzar into Babylon. And we've talked about that. That is where we get the story of Daniel and the Babylonian exile, is what it's called. During that time, the Samaritans were not taken away. So the Jews who were in the region of Samaria stayed there and continued to flourish. And when the Jews from Babylon finally came back, and that is around the time of the story that we know of as Esther, whenever they came back, then those who were in Samaria said that the Jews who had been away in Babylon had allowed their religion to become twisted or slightly skewed, and that they no longer practiced true Judaism, and only the Samaritans did. So the Samaritans stopped going to Jerusalem for the ceremonies and festivals, and instead they established their own services and festivals up in their area. Now this was highly offensive to the Jews in Judea and up in Galilee, so they shunned them. They viewed them like a distant cousin that nobody wanted to talk to. And usually in scriptural studies, the cousins are the ones that cause the most problems. We've talked about the Moabites and the Ammonites and where they came from, which is not a pleasant thought, and how those cousins have caused nothing but trouble for the rest of the Israelite nation. But Samaria was someone you did not want to talk to. You would not even cross through the land if possible. Of course, Jesus is going to go into Samaria with his apostles during his ministry, which is probably going to be quite shocking to the apostles. But he also had them do several other things which was highly unusual for them, such as rowing across the Sea of Galilee, which would have been absolutely terrifying to the poor apostles. But let's get back into the story now that we know a little bit about Samaria. So, Jesus, in Luke 10, we get this story. It says, on one occasion, an expert in the law, which means it's probably a Pharisee, stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus responds, what is written in the law? How do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind. And love your neighbor as yourself. Now, Jesus says, you have answered correctly. Jesus replied, do this and you will live. That is an amazing compliment from Jesus. He's done the right thing. He's summarized all of Scripture into those two passages. But the expert in the law, wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" In reply, Jesus said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho." And remember that Jerusalem is up on a hill, series of hills, and Jericho, you have to actually, even though you're going northeast, you're actually going down. When he fell into the hands of robbers, they stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. All right, let's take a brief pause here and give you some background. So we have to love your Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind. Okay, this is called the Shema, and it's found in Deuteronomy 6. It was a passage that all fathers and children were supposed to recite several times a day. And it starts off with, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. These commandments I give to you today are to be upon your heart. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates." And you were supposed to recite this at least 3 times a day. And normally, inside of a home, a Jewish home, you're going to find this thing right here. This is called a mezuzah. And the mezuzah is traditionally, there was some confusion as to whether it should be mounted horizontally or vertically. And so quite a while ago, they decided to just slant it to have it at a tilt. But inside of this casing, and there's all sorts of different varieties of them, metal or clay or wood, inside of it traditionally is rolled up a small piece of paper with the Shema in it. And you're supposed to, of course, touch this as you leave the door, as you leave your home and come back in, to remind yourself to always be thinking of God. So that is where the first passage comes from. So that's good. The second passage that he quotes about loving your neighbor as yourself is actually taken from Leviticus 19. And this is a section where Moses is being given the law by God, and it's a rather lengthy section. And you're going through, and it's talking about things like in verse 15, don't pervert justice, don't show partiality to the poor, favoritism. Okay, that's good. We also see that in the wisdom book of James in the Greek text, which is, remember, the only wisdom book found in the Greek text. Do not slander. Get down to 17. Do not hate a fellow Israelite in your heart. Rebuke your neighbor frankly, so that you will not share in their guilt. And then we get to 18. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Okay. So the expert in the law is quoting Genesis and Leviticus. That's good, solid Torah knowledge. And Jesus responds by giving him the compliment. You've answered right. But, like we said, the young man wanted to find out exactly who his neighbors are, which means he didn't really, I guess, like the answer Jesus gave him, which is really weird. But he's wanting to figure out a way to trap Jesus, which is what they were trying to do at this particular point in Jesus' ministry. So, Jesus continues telling the story. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, and passed by on the other side. Okay, so why a priest and a Levite? Well, Jesus is talking to an expert in the law, and he's probably surrounded by others who are experts in the law. And he's pointing out that the ones who should know more about Scripture than anybody else should be the priest, okay, who works in the temple, and the Levite, who the priests are taken from the tribe of Levites. So these two groups should know it better than anybody else. They should know the Torah. Okay? But what do? They walk around. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. That's typical first aid in the first century. That's okay. Then he put the man on his own donkey, took him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins, gave them to the innkeeper. "Look after him," he said, "and when I return I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have." Okay. So he binds his wounds, takes care of him, puts him on his own donkey, which means he probably walks next to the wounded man, and then gives 2 silver coins, or 2 denarii, to the innkeeper, which means that's like 2 days' wage. And then he said, "I'll reimburse you when I come back." So he's not just helping the guy, he's going out of his way physically with the donkey and going out of his way financially and time-wise. Because notice, he's going to come back this way. He says, "When I return, I will reimburse you for the extra expense you have." So he's going to check up on the man. And Jesus asked the expert in the law, which of these 3 do you think was the neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." I've always found it interesting here that the expert in the law says the one who had mercy on him. So I guess he wasn't even able to say the word Samaritan. He could have. It would not have been a bad thing to say the word Samaritan. But you're not supposed to talk about the Samaritans because they're the cousins that we don't talk about anymore. And then Jesus, I love it at the end, he just shuts him down. "Go and do likewise. We're done talking." Yeah. So as far as there's lots of different artistic interpretations of this. We get some really interesting ones. And of course, in a lot of really nice cathedrals, you'll get stained glass versions of various paintings, which is really nice. Well done. See variations of the same theme right here. This one's a good one. This was done a few decades ago, which I think it helps bring up opposition to some degree. This one's probably very accurate as far as the way it looked, the rocks. Yeah. All right, so let's move on to our second story today, which is the prodigal son. Okay, so the prodigal son we find in Luke 15. So switch over to Luke 15. And we're in a section of parables that Jesus is giving in Luke. And he gives a bunch. It's just almost a machine gun fire of parables, just one right after the other one that Luke has recorded. We have the mustard seed and the yeast. We have his discussion of being the Pharisees' home, the cost of being a disciple. Then we have the parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, and then we have the parable of the lost son, which is interesting because we know it now as the parable of the prodigal son. But originally that's not necessarily what it was called. And then, of course, right after this, we have one of the most interesting stories, which hopefully we'll get to in a couple of lectures, which is the parable of the shrewd manager, which leaves a lot of people kind of scratching their head with that one as to what Jesus was actually trying to say. But let's go over with the parable of the lost son, or the parable of the prodigal son. Well, the first thing we need to make note of and pay attention to is the word prodigal. if I ask my students in my class what it means, a lot of them will tell me it means lost or wayward. So this is the son who went off, became lost in the world, and then came back. That's not actually what the word prodigal means. The word means wasteful or recklessly extravagant. And this is kind of an important thing to pay attention to, because I've heard several people tell me that the prodigal son really isn't about the youngest son. It's about the oldest son who stays with the dad. He's the one who's really lost and doesn't know what's going on. Well, that's true. He doesn't really understand the relationship as it should be, but he's not the prodigal son. He's just kind of stubborn and narrow-minded. But let's go into Luke 15. So here we go. The prodigal son. So Jesus continued. All right. And I think this is an important point because it's okay. Jesus continued. Let's continue and put them off. 6:30. Start again at 16:30. So, in Luke 15, it says, Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them." Okay, let's stop right there. Of course, in the law, how it's divided up is the oldest son, of course, gets the double share, which means in this case, the land would be divided in, if there are only the 2 sons, it would be divided into 3 sections. The oldest son would get 2 of the sections. The youngest son would get the 3rd section. And that's not being unfair, as some people have tried to point out, because the oldest son culturally has to look after his parents when they get older, and he also has to look after, or if his father dies, he has to look after his mother, and he has to look after all the unmarried daughters, or his sisters who are unmarried. So that's the reason he's given the double portion, is so he can look after everyone. Now that extra section that the oldest son has, he is allowed to sell it. It's incredibly rare, but it can be done. So when we look back in the Hebrew text, the story of Esau selling off his birthright to Jacob, that actually could be done. That's completely okay. That doesn't mean that Esau is going to be left out in the cold. Esau is still going to have that first chunk of land that every son gets. He's just selling off the extra one, which he did. And that's another story which we can listen to. That's a really interesting lecture. So, the son says, "Let me have my share of the estate." What that means, in effect, culturally, is he's telling his father, "I wish you were dead and that I could have my inheritance right now. I don't care about you." So, the father does it. Divided his property between them. Not long after that, the young son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. Yep. It's almost like he went to college. After he spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to the fields to feed pigs. Oh man, this is a great point. Jesus is pointing this out to everybody. This kid hit rock bottom. Not only did he tell his parents he wished they were dead, but he is now at a point where he is eating and around pigs, which of course you're not supposed to be around, because if you go back and look at Levitical law, you're not supposed to be around pigs. They are unclean. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything, which probably means he did eat the slop in the pig troughs. Oops. Is see if we can get back to this. Well, hopefully y'all can see through that. We'll keep going. Okay. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired men have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men.'" Okay, which culturally you could do. Okay. Remember that usually when you sold yourself into indentured slavery, which is what this would be, indentured servitude, traditionally you would only be in that position for about 6 years, and then you would be released from it, unless of course you liked being a slave, in which case you could tell your master, "I want to stay your servant," and that's when he would drive the peg through your ear, and you would become his permanent slave or servant. Hey. But that's why he said, "I'll just go to my dad and say, 'Hey, I'll work for you like a hired man.'" He got up and went to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to his servants, "Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Bring a ring for his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For the son of mine was dead, and now he's alive again. He was lost and is found." So they began to celebrate. Okay, so a couple of quick things. First of all, the fact that he ran to his son. Traditionally, in this culture, if you were the oldest person, you did not run, especially to a person of a lower social standing. Traditionally, you would sit and wait, and the younger person would approach you, and then you would usually bow to them or offer some sort of servitude or symbol of servitude to them, and then they would talk to you. The fact that he runs to his son means that he doesn't care. He doesn't care about the culture. He cares about his son. That's a fantastic comment. The second thing that's interesting here is he sees his son while he was a long way off, which is an absolutely beautiful passage, because that means the father is looking for his lost son. Every day, probably, all the time. Okay. He ran up, he threw his arms around him and kissed him. Even though the boy probably smelled like pig and, yeah, pretty bad, didn't matter to the father. He immediately tells his dad, "I've sinned against heaven and against you. I've done wrong." Dad doesn't care. You're back. That's the most important thing. And you're back and you have a penitent heart, which is even better. He puts a robe on him, probably for status, gives him a ring, which is probably a signet ring, indicating he has authority in the family again. In other words, the father forgives all of that. He forgives the fact that the boy wished he were dead. And he's going to celebrate. The fatted calf, of course, is whenever they would keep one for special occasions, and this is a very special occasion, so that's why he's going to kill the fatted calf. And they begin to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing, so he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. "Your brother has come," he replied, "and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has him back safe and sound." The older brother became angry and refused to go in, so his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fatted calf for him." "My son," the father said, "you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." So I guess the point on this one is to realize that the oldest son just needed to ask the father, and he never did. Now, we run across inverted parallelism in this parable. Remember, this is a common traditional way to do Hebrew writing and poetry. The entire book of Esther is a giant case of inverted parallelism that we can see, which you can go back and listen to the lecture on that, or read it yourself, and you'll notice that it's parallel. So you can take a look at this. You see that the son is lost, and then the son is found. Gifts are squandered. Goods are used for celebration. Everything lost gains everything when he gets the ring and the robe back. Yeah. Great sin, great repentance, rejection, acceptance, change of mind, and change of mind. It's really interesting how they do that. Yeah. We don't do that as much in a lot of Western poetry. Now, the prodigal son is a very popular topic. If you even go to like Poem Hunter, here I just go in and type prodigal son, you'll run across 21 different poems dealing with it and titled it. Rudyard Kipling, you see, Newton, several great poets. There is two that really stand out if you want to read them and look them up. One is, of course, E.A. Robinson's The Prodigal Son, which he was an amazing poet, but the one that I included in this lecture is The Prodigal by Elizabeth Bishop. And she does a really good job of pointing out a couple of things in this poem that you normally don't think about. So the fact that the odor is around him at the beginning, the brown, enormous odor he lived by, was too close. Remember, this is still an unclean thing, and he grew up a Jew boy. He knows that that is an unclean thing. The floor was rotten, the sty was plastered, halfway up with grass-smoothed dung. She does a great job pointing some stuff out. He stumbles along in the darkness, you find out, with bats overhead, pigs next to him. I always think that's an interesting point. Bats are also unclean animals, just like pigs in Levitical law. But then you get here to the end, carrying a bucket along a slimy board. He felt the bat's uncertain, staggering flight, his stuttering insights beyond his control touching him. But it took him a long time finally to make up his mind to go home. Yeah, because you got to swallow your pride. It's a great poem. Okay. So we have some great artistic interpretations of the prodigal son, not just in poetry, but as you can see here, this one up here, let me show you right here. This is Rembrandt's famous painting. And I think it's called The Return of the Prodigal Son, if I remember correctly. It's an interesting painting because if you notice, the hands are different, and this is what everybody points out. One hand is masculine, which is the left hand, and as you see, it's on his son's shoulder. And then the other hand over here on this other side is feminine. It's smaller hand. It's supposed to represent, we believe, the totality of God in both male and female. And if you notice, the male hand is on the shoulder offering comfort, whereas the female hand is on the back offering comfort. which I think is pretty fascinating. How he did that. Let's see. This one is one that I found that I really like. You see the Father is running, which is, I love that point. Everything is light. Of course, you have the light side over here with the Father, and then the dark side over here. And you have a couple of things that you may not notice right off the bat. See, there's the Father running. As he's entering and approaching his Father, you have, of course, skulls here representing death. You have a crucifix up there on the side of the hill. And then, of course, you have in the background a bunch of ziggurats. So, probably indicating either a primitive or pagan culture. So, which would explain why he had pigs there that he was feeding. Sorry about that. You didn't need to see that big swipe. There we go. This one's a great one over here with the tears in his eyes. It's a good story. Good parable. So the question we end up with, why these two stories? Why the Good Samaritan and the Prodigal Son? Do we need to focus on them? I mean, the Good Samaritan is a great story to remember, that everybody is your neighbor, right? The Prodigal Son is also a great one to remember, that no matter how far down you fall, that the Father is always looking for you and wanting you back. But the thing that always pops back into my head too when I look at this, not only are those points, but is this. Back in Genesis 4, we have the story of Cain and Abel. And of course, Cain's sacrifice was not accepted by God, and there's several Jewish stories and mythologies that go with that exactly. And then Abel's was, and so Cain kills Abel. And at the end down here, the Lord said to Cain, "Where's your brother Abel?" "I don't know," he replied. "Am I my brother's keeper?" This is the passage. There are two incredibly important passages in Genesis. This one, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And later the passage about Abraham being considered righteous in God's eyes, even though there was no law. But this one, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And of course the answer is, yes, you are. And the entire rest of canon scriptures answers this question as to how you are supposed to be your brother's keeper. It's all about relationships. And the Prodigal Son and the Good Samaritan are beautiful examples of these relationships. Relationships within your family, relationships within your neighborhood. Who are you supposed to look after? All of them, even the ones you don't like. So that's the end of our lecture today on the first part of the teachings of Jesus. We'll have another one coming up soon. And shalom.